Hi everyone, welcome back to Nukleopatra, making a Dead or Alive album with me, Barry Stone. I'm looking back on the album I recorded with the band back in 1994, which has just celebrated its 30th anniversary. I've been speaking with people involved in the project, some of whom have a history with Dead or Alive that goes way back, even before the Nukleopatra era. As a super fan of the band, I've been on the edge of my seat listening to these guests, and I can't wait to share our chats with you lot. So plenty to come in the episodes to follow. In the last episode though, we covered the band returning to PWL, me fulfilling my teenage dream of not only meeting Pete and Steve, but actually getting to work with them. It's February 1994, and we've just recorded 3 songs: Rebel Rebel, Unhappy Birthday, and I'm a Star. This was the beginning of recording the Nukleopatra album, although at the time I had no idea it would turn into a whole album. After recording the first 3 tracks in the Fairlight room, it was time to take them up to the Bunker studio to be mixed by Les Sharma. Les and I had worked closely together for a number of years by this point. Les in the Bunker assisting Phil Harding, with me in the Fairlight room assisting Ian Curnow. Les started working at PWL roughly a year before me, and like me, he'd got his job by pestering the studio until they let him in the building. I caught up with Les to hear his stories of mixing Nukleopatra at PWL, but in the first part of our chat, I asked him what it was like to start working at the Hit Factory in 1988.
Well, when I first started, I was working with Mike and Matt in the Borough studio upstairs, and literally it was tea making, ringing the cafe round the corner, John's Cafe, finding out what the specials were every day, and then taking that list into Matt or Mike and Yo-Yo and Karen or whoever's working in the studio, and getting a list of what they wanted for lunch. And then when I wasn't doing that, then you just be like sitting in the studio observing the whole recording process, and ideally being an assistant to the sound engineer. And obviously in those days it was Karen and Yo-Yo, and you would just work closely with them, and they would send you for leads and chords, and can you plug up a keyboard, or Matt wants to go down to another studio, can you make sure the keyboards are set up for him? Or Mike would say, oh, we want to work on a different track now, can you find Kylie whatever? And then we'd have to go and find those tapes, put the tapes on, set a session up for him. So it was just a bit of everything, basically.
Yeah, I mean, when I was going through that, it was just, I wasn't really taking much in. The technical side of things, I wasn't really grasping. There was just like so much to take in.
Yeah, it is a lot. And I remember the first year or the first few years of PWL, the technical stuff just didn't click with me. There was so much to take on board. And then I can't remember what happened. It just all of a sudden, it just started coming together. But you are right. A lot of it's information overload. And particularly when you're 16, and my first week at PWL, they were recording the Donna Summer stuff. And I vividly remember it, she was a big act, and, everyone was excited to have Donna there. Actually, I changed from being starstruck. When you work at PWL, you meet so many famous people, and you see so many famous people in the kitchen and crossing the stairs and so on. You become numb to it eventually.
Yes.
So you turn up at work and
all right, Donna.
Yeah, exactly. But you just became used to it. Initially I was very starstruck, and I was so excited to they were saying, oh, Kylie's in, or Jason's in, or Sonia, so on. But then eventually that just changes, and you just take it in your stride then, and it just becomes the norm, really.
So go back, because I don't know this.
Yeah.
So those first few weeks and working on the Donna album, were you kicked out of the sessions when she was doing her vocals, or were you allowed to stay in?
No, I don't know. The only time I can remember being kicked out of sessions is when Mike and Matt were actually writing. The writing process, it was usually Mike and Matt only in the studio, and possibly Karen would stay in with them. But that was that was a personal moment to them, and they didn't want people around, so they would boot you out. But in terms of the artists, I can't remember. No, I just think the Donna Summer sessions were just normal sessions, basically.
Wow, so you were sitting in a session when she was singing?
Yeah, honestly. And I remember she gave me an autograph. I remember she wrote on she gave me a signed photo saying, Les, you're learning incredible things. And she signed it Donna Summer.
Wow.
And yeah, she had an assistant with her who was really nice. Absolutely lovely. Really, really nice people. week one at PWL was a big one for me.
Wow.
Doing that.
At some point, Les switched from working in the top studio with Stock Aitken and Waterman to assisting Harding and Curnow in the bottom two studios. This was the beginning of Les's apprenticeship working under Phil Harding. Dead or Alive fans will know Phil Harding worked closely with the band on not only the two Stock Aitken and Waterman produced albums, but also on the now legendary murder mix of You Spin Me Round. Les shared with me what it was like to assist the mixmaster at PWL.
Phil was the best mentor ever, and he taught me so much. He taught me some stuff that I, even in running my business now, I still use some of his principles and just the way he thinks about things, and how he structures things. It was very structured, and the sessions were very calm. Normal working times, like 10 in the morning, 10 to 10. The Phil Harding sessions were like that. He was so organized, and he was a fantastic mixer, songwriter, producer.
I think because Mike, Matt, Pete and Phil had all been doing it for so long, when they started PWL, there was an ethos to the company that they weren't going to work weekends. That was a no-no, and they were basically going to finish at a decent hour.
Yeah, because I think when they were at the Marquee, you'll hear Pete and Phil talk about mixing, Dead or Alive, the Spin Me Round tracks and doing the 12-inch mixes, and it was an all day and all night affair, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To be working 18, 20-hour sessions. But actually, when I actually started PW, I was actually quite surprised. And realistically, Mike and Matt would turn up 11 o'clock. I would be there like an hour before. And by 9, 10 o'clock, Mike, Matt and Pete would round a pub, possibly with Phil, and the sessions were being wound down. And by 10, half 10, we were finished.
All those years of working under Phil, Les was learning tips and tricks that would come in very handy when it came to mixing the Nukleopatra album. In 1993, like me, he also started to hear whispers that Dead or Alive were to return to PWL.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly who told me. More than likely, it would have been Pete Waterman, because he was the man with the gossip talking about Dead or Alive returning. The only thing I do remember prior to that story even coming out, we were talking in studios about past sessions, and Dead or Alive just had a bit of a reputation for being just a bit problematic in the studio.
Yeah.
So there was a reputation with Steve and Pete, and the band in general. I remember there was a story knocking around with one of the assistant engineers who had worked with them, before I'd even started at PWL. And I think the story was he fell asleep and a certain part of his body was painted with Tipp-Ex, and then he woke up and found all his Tipp-Ex over his body and stuff like that. So the boys had done that when he was asleep. So we always had to joke, if you're working with Dead or Alive, don't fall asleep on their session. So there was there were just stories, and they had a reputation for just being notorious in the studio. Pete Burns and Steve are massive characters, but yeah, absolutely lovely. Once you got to know them, just really nice people to work with.
Yeah, but you didn't fall asleep, did you?
No, that's one thing I didn't do, actually. No.
So we're going to hear more from Les a bit later, when we'll do a deep dive into mixing not only Nukleopatra, but generally how records at PWL were mixed back in the 80s and 90s. Any SAW or PWL fans won't want to miss this chat, as I think it gives a really good insight into how we worked in the building back then. In the first episode, we talked about recording David Bowie's Rebel Rebel and how Pete had written new lyrics to include in his version of the song. Adding these new words to the recording required permission from Mr. Bowie in order for the record to be released. So a copy of our version was sent over to him, and we waited to hear back, hoping approval would be given, as we'd all really become attached to the new bits Pete had added. Lynne Burns remembers why Pete chose to cover the song, but also the fateful day when Pete and Steve heard back from the Bowie camp, and it wasn't good news.
Pete had always loved Bowie, and it just felt apt. It went with his image. I think he just really wanted to record that because of the lyrics.
Yeah.
That he could apply to himself. Pete wanted to change the lyrics and Bowie wouldn't allow it. So he was very upset with Dame David.
Do you remember when they got the call about that, or was he really disappointed?
Yes. Yeah, he hated David Bowie.
After that?
How dare she? Yeah.
It was a shame. But
I mean, he wasn't changing the lyrics, he was adding to
yeah, he had a verse.
Yeah.
But the silver lining, because we wouldn't have had the track Nukleopatra had he not
Correct.
rejected it. Permission to change the song was not granted, and I believe Mr. Bowie had requested the band not release this version at all. We were all really disappointed, and I'm sure Bowie's response must have stung Pete, as the song had been an anthem for him growing up as a teenager. In any interviews after that, he was quite vocal about his dislike for the singer. But all was not lost. As I said to Lynne, some of the lyrics that Pete had written, which now couldn't be used for Rebel Rebel, were repurposed for a new song, which would not only give the album its title, but one of its strongest songs. More about that one later. The band and PWL by now had decided that despite the Bowie hiccup, Rebel Rebel would be a single, and plans for its release were underway. We set about tweaking the version in order for it to meet the requirements of what's called a compulsory license. This basically means you don't change any of the lyrics, and that way you can release your new version without needing any permission from the writer. You're welcome, Dave. So just as we get that sorted, Pete decides to throw a major spanner in the works when he announces that he wants the new record not to be released under the name of Dead or Alive. Can you remember the discussions around changing the name to International Chrysis?
Yes. I think it was unanimous. It was a bad idea. It was Pete that really wanted to do that. And we were like, no. But he was obsessed with Chrysis, this trans person. And he just wanted to honour her, and he thought it was timely, but it was a silly idea. We didn't need any more confusion, did we, really? People were confused enough. What is it? Who is it? Why?
Yeah, I'm glad they went back to Dead or Alive.
Yes, me too. It's like, what were you thinking? It was just a moment of madness, which Pete accepted it was.
I wonder also whether did it have an impact in like promoting the thing? I mean,
well, yes, of course, because who the hell are International Chrysis?
Yeah.
And particularly given that they'd had a bit of a gap. So to come back with this, no, it was never going to work, was it? And I think also it was Pete trying to get away from the whole spin me round thing, not realising that that was a great asset. So I'm glad they changed it back.
Yes, possibly a moment of madness, but not everyone at the label saw this as a problem. I asked David Howells, managing director of PWL, what he thought. Did it matter that they changed the name at that point?
No, it didn't. Really didn't, no. And artists do that from time to time, and you've got to be able to back that up and deliver and be yourself, and people will ride with you or not. But no, it wasn't. I wouldn't have viewed it as very important.
Okay, so basically, from your side of things, promoting this record, it didn't really make it to have that much impact, that you're not promoting a Dead or Alive record anymore. It's actually this new entity.
Essentially, you're promoting Pete Burns again. And the guy was such an iconic figure by this time, without a doubt. It was and that voice, again, it's always about the voice.
Whether it's Dead or Alive or International Chrysis, the voice is unmistakable, and Pete's distinctive tenor was one of his calling cards. The other, obviously, being his image. Pete was constantly changing his image, and with each new album, he would sport a striking brand new look. The Nukleopatra era was no exception. When I first met Pete in January 94, he already had the Nukleopatra look. This was before the album title and before the sound of the album had started to come together. This brand new look went together so well with the music. Lynne remembers how the look came about.
I mean, he was sick of his curls. He wanted straight. And it was too much to manage, so we started to do kind of extension wig kind of combos. And it turned out it was much easier to do that because of, you could just plonk it on.
Easier than the curls.
Yeah. Lower maintenance. But yeah, we all liked.
It was such a strong look.
Yeah.
Some would say it was probably one of his best.
Yes, I would. Because the hair was there before the album title.
Yes, because he was looking like that when he first started coming to the studio.
Yeah.
That's how I remember him.
It's kind of how it all just fell in place. It wasn't a preconceived thing. I'm going to have my hair like... I mean, he was always obsessed with Cher when he was a kid, so that came about from that.
He had the look, he had the record. It was now time to make the video. The band teamed up with director Xana to shoot the music video for Rebel Rebel. As Pete's creative collaborator, Lynne, of course, was there, and I asked her to share her thoughts on putting this one together.
We sort of self-styled it, you know, so we collaborated on that video, and just doing them was the 4 different... In my opinion, it was the best video he'd ever done.
And I was going to say, because this is the first video that's actually just him.
Yeah.
There's no other distractions, it's just Pete.
Yes.
Tell me about how the ideas for that came about. Like, was this you, Pete and Steve brainstorming, or how did
and Xana, because
So
they'd
Xana
had
was
this
involved.
idea they were going to make it kind of Warhol graphics. I can't remember how it came about that Pete played the 4 characters, but in truth, any videos in the past, it was always difficult to have that cohesive thing with a band that don't look, you know, they're not really interested in dressing up like Mike and Tim.
Yeah.
And Steve never particularly enjoyed being in front of the camera.
But he did it so well.
Yes. But I mean, that video I think was his best because it was just Pete and we didn't have to think about...
Accommodating any...
Yeah. And also we just went through Pete's wardrobe for that. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
You know, we didn't have to get anything brought in. Yeah, again, it was about the budget. The budgets were so small. So we had an idea, you know, each character.
Johnny Blunder.
Yeah. Debbie Harris.
Debbie Harrods.
That's the one.
And
yes.
Miss Mouse.
They were so based on rock stars of the 70s.
Yeah. I was really excited because Steve invited me down to the shoot that day. And what I remember is you being a one-woman glam squad, like you were doing hair, makeup and styling.
Standard, yeah.
So, was that standard?
Oh, yeah.
So for all the
Yeah.
videos that had come before, that was pretty much your...
Yeah.
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 And you
the
loved
photo
it.
sessions. Absolutely loved it. I mean, for me, it was a dream come true because that was always my thing, you know, hair, makeup, fashion. And Pete could be quite chaotic as well. He could change his mind at the drop of a hat.
So you'd always have to have a backup.
I'd always be there on hand to accommodate him, whatever it was.
It was a brilliant video, though.
Yeah, I loved it.
I remember.
It's one of my faves.
The video is one of Pete's best, but I'm not actually sure how much screen time it got on TV in the run-up to its release. The single came out in June 94. Pete made a few TV appearances to promote it, but ultimately the single didn't connect with the public, and it got to a disappointing number 76 in the charts.
This happens. You can have hit after hit after hit, several in a row, and then one doesn't connect, and for whatever reason, timing is usually the issue. But at the end of the day, as I've always said, the choice is the public's. You have to connect with the public, and there's something... It's always the decision of the public at the end of the day. You know, you and I can make the greatest record in the world, in our mind.
Yeah.
I had a conversation once with an American record producer, and he said, Dave, I never once came out of the studio without having made a number 1 record. Unfortunately, the public didn't always agree with me. And I thought, yeah, that about sums it up. You know, we can kid ourselves that it's our promotion, it's our studio, it's our producer, it's our engineer. At the end of the day, the public just yawn and look the other way sometimes, and then you have to keep going around till you find that thing that connects.
Despite failing to set the charts alight, it wasn't all doom and gloom. As I found out, I was needed back in the studio to record more material with Pete and Steve. More on that coming up later. But back to my chat with Les now. We're going to talk all about mixing a record at PWL, as well as Les's memories of working with the band.
Steve and Pete lived in a different time zone to normal people. I think they would spend most of the nights awake, sleeping late, and waking up early afternoon and then rolling into the studio. Pete, all three, even Lynne would come into the studio. And like 6, 7 o'clock sounded like a good time they would turn up. And from 5 onwards, you could expect them, and they would get a taxi from their house. And from Notting Hill, they'd get a taxi in. And I was thinking about it today. They were just super generous. I remember he would order up like sushi, these massive sushi trays, from a place in Soho, and it'd be delivered. Steve was very generous.
He was.
Drinks. He would pay for food. You didn't have to put your hand in your pocket in these sessions. Some sessions you do, but he would keep us in food and drink basically.
Yeah.
And also, pay us well for doing the work. Like we were on a day rate, pay us cash, and he'd always have a wad of cash on him.
Yeah, that's I was thinking. I remember this the other day. I'd be out, and sometimes I would just bump into him. Just wouldn't
Yeah.
even be out with him, and he'd like
Yeah.
put a 50 quid note in my hand, like he was a favorite
it.
uncle. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, he was always doing 50. Yeah, he always, and he would give whoever the assistant was. He would give him 50 quid. I remember when we went to whatever studios we went to besides PWL. Here's 50 quid for you. Here's 50 quid.
Yeah, he was very generous.
Absolutely generous. But when they actually did arrive, all I do remember that because of our training, everything was well recorded. All credit to you, Barry. You did all the vocals downstairs, and all those tracks are just well recorded, which makes my life easier when you start pushing the faders up and everything sounds good straight away. I'd even just go back to the SAW mixes that Phil would do. When Phil were doing a Stock Aitken Waterman mix, you just push those faders up and those songs just sounded like hits, straight away. And so going back to Dead or Alive, I do just remembered everything being recorded nicely. And, I think Pete obviously had a big voice. And, he wasn't he's a fantastic singer, but quite loud. I remember the Rebel track because I remember Tilly in the offices going on by Rebel, and they were doing a David Bowie cover.
So you remember there was excitement in the building?
There was.
Yeah,
I do remember that. And I do remember Tilly. I'm sure, I don't know why I think of Tilly.
As well as Tilly, I remember Pete Waterman being loving Unhappy Birthday. He adored that track. He was a real champion of that song.
So was that one of the three then as
that
well?
was one of the first three, yeah.
So I have no memory of Rebel obviously, but the other two I couldn't even remember.
Yeah.
But
it's important to say to the listeners that Les has mixed so many records, and this was 30 years ago. It's hard to pinpoint and be specific about this particular sessions. But I think what maybe would be good for the listeners to hear is how would you approach any mix that you did, not just Dead or Alive, but explain to the listeners what you would do.
Yeah, well, even if we go back to the basics, even like whoever was my assistant engineer in those days, the simplest of stuff, get a tape, put a tape on, plug up the adboard gear, the effects that I would normally use on a mix, write up the track sheet, what instruments are on what track, preparing the session, like how I would prepare a session for Phil to walk into. My assistant would do a similar setup for me. So the first step really is just to push the faders up and just play the track a few times through and just learn the arrangement, learn what instruments are playing where, what instruments are doing what's working, what isn't working. We were constantly listening to big pop records at the time or big club records at the time. And, we wanted our records to sound as good as their records or better. So, I would speak to you initially to find out how we want this mix to sound before we mix it a different way, and it sounds like a George Michael record when we should be sounding like a Snap record. What I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons to it because there's sometimes it's good for a mixer to come in fresh because they're going to hear elements of the track that you've done that maybe perhaps the producer thinks that's not important, but the mixer doesn't know that, and they might use it as a feature. But when you hear it fresh, maybe after taking a break, maybe the mixer's got a better take on things. I mean, I was quite close to this project, so I probably did have my vision of how it should be. So probably it doesn't always work that way. But there is pros and cons to having a mixer coming in fresh and not being involved in the production.
And to be fair, I completely agree with that. Like fresh airs and doing something different. But from memory, I don't think, particularly in the early days of PWL, we just didn't work like that. It was regimented and things needed to sound a certain way. And even like, the Phil and Ian productions and the SAW productions, a lot of the instruments and the Funky Joes and all the sequencers were sort of repeated on different records.
Because they knew it worked.
Yeah, exactly. It worked, and then they also work with certain effects, like like 8 delays or triplet delays, and certain reverbs made them sound better. So you would learn those process. So when I pushed up a fader and there was like a little sequence, straight away you put in like an 8 delay and a certain reverb on it, and it makes it sound like bigger, more exciting. So we definitely used to work like that,
Yeah. So yeah, you're going to hear an element in the track that you think, oh yeah, I remember what I did with that on such and such a record. I'll just do that again because
Absolutely.
yeah, it's become second nature.
And the whole process of PWL was so regimented. I remember vividly the first, between from nine, like nine would be the kick drum, eight would be the bass. We'd have 8 tracks of drums. Say you had a 24-track machine, so the first 8 would be keyboards, then drums, then vocals. Everything was blocked together, well recorded. You have a snare on 10 and then a hi-hat. And because we learned that way, and everyone we didn't have to work that way, it just made sense to work that way. You would record that way downstairs. And I remember you saying me, what track do you want this on? And, you remember?
Vaguely,
And
yeah.
stuff. And what you didn't want to do, because you had an analog machine downstairs, you wouldn't want to put a kick drum next to the vocal track because you'd get a bleed from the kick drum onto the vocal track.
Yes, I remember that now.
So you had analog machines, so you had to think about all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you'd put a nice pad next to the vocal or something
exactly,
very
something
soft.
softer, or just leave it. Yeah, or time. Yeah, even time code. You could hear time code bleeding through onto the vocal track sometimes.
God.
But going back to your, and it was a vision, because I've mixed a lot of your stuff when you did stuff with Julian, and even the Adam Ricketts stuff, and even your own stuff, Barry. You have a thing, either I want that really dry and upfront, or I want it swamped in reverb to make it sound like, like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And unless that information is relayed to the person mixing, you're going to get it wrong from the start, basically. So it's always nice to speak to listen. With Stock Aitken Waterman records, it was different. Those records, when they were churning out of hits, were amazing tracks, amazing productions. We all know how successful they were, but they were very standardized. When Phil or Pete Hammond or Dave Ford were mixing those records, they didn't need to communicate with SAW about that, because there was a formula in place.
Yeah.
And Mike and Matt would say, follow the formula of the last number one we just had.
Exactly. And also there wouldn't be time really to, this is why Phil and Pete were used over and over again, is because they were getting it right. Mike and Matt didn't have to spend hours in the studio going through, oh, can you fix this or do that? They trusted them, and it just happened. And it was very rare that they changed very much, to be honest.
Yeah, it was a trust factor, and everyone did trust each other, and everyone knew how they worked, and no one wanted to be experimental. I remember engineering. There's a car. I didn't engineer for Mike a lot, but later, when Pete Day was sick or I was needed, I'd have to engineer for Mike. And I remember a couple of times he said to me, I was just engineering for him, and he would say, "Don't make this sound like the bunker," because I'd make it sound more just drum heavy, or he would say, no, I know you've been working with Phil, but don't make it sound like a dance record.
Okay.
Even they are dance. Do you know what I mean? And Mike was more into the song, which is fun, and instrumentation.
Yeah.
And I would go up there and get a rough mix ready for when he came in. I remember him distinctly coming in and pulling the faders down and rebalancing the track,
doing his own mix. But going back to these first Dead or Alive mixes, so you'd get up the faders, you'd put your effects on them, and can you remember how long would you spend before either me and Steve would come in to have a listen?
Yeah, well, I think the normal, if the tapes are ready in the morning and I turn up there like between 10 and 11, then I'd spend 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah,
maybe till about, and then you'd be popping in and we'd have discussions about the tracks. Pete and Steve wouldn't turn up till gone 6 o'clock, but you would be there obviously. And so I would learn the track, learn the arrangement, and the process at PWL, or the Phil Harding way, which is the way I sort of worked, we're just starting with the kick drum, and then mixing the drums. Basically, if there's 8 or 9 tracks of drums, snare, hi-hat, congas, drum loops, mixing the drums till you're happy with that. EQing, compressing, just getting a good drum balance. We'd get a bass in, then keyboards. We'd build a mix up slowly, starting with drums and adding bass, then keyboards, and at the same time trying different levels. Does this work louder? Or does this need to be quieter in the mix? If you have the wrong levels on certain things, you can really screw things up, basically. And so it is an art form, and you have to just get things sounding right along through the whole process. You're just constantly adding, you're polishing, you're adding reverb, you're adding delay, you're adding compressors, you're thinking about a balance all the time. And then we had like three different types of speakers at PWL. We had Genelecs towards the end, but we had some Uris before that. We had three different monitors, basically. NS10s were the smallest.
yeah.
We would want the mix to sound good on all those speakers.
Yeah, because basically people are going to be listening to these records on all different types of systems. So if they sounded good on all three of your speakers, then chances are they're going to sound good on.
Absolutely. Ideally, the goal was, because we were churning out pop records in those days, we wanted them to sound good on the radio. So, the NS10s was our radio reference, basically. Yeah. So once they sounded good in the NS10s, if we put them on the big speakers and there wasn't enough bass, you're trying to replicate like a club environment with the big speakers now. If they weren't sounding good in the big speakers, then you would have to tweak the balance, or even do different versions. As we did many versions of PWL. We do a radio version, and then club versions we mixed mainly on the bigger speakers to make them work in a club. Because there's nothing worse than doing a club mix that a DJ plays that night in a big club and it just sounds just completely wrong, or there's not enough bass, or there's not enough excitement. And Pete would tell us that. Pete would play stuff on a Hitman and Her and come back and say, this sounded rubbish, we need to redo it. Because we followed a formula at PWL, and I used the same formula really with the Dead or Alive mixes, they sounded great. They sounded, even to this day, they sound fantastic on a phone.
Yeah. That chat with Les about the way we used to mix back in the day really brought back some great memories. Such a special time. Obviously, technology has come on leaps and bounds since we made this album, and the way we make records today is very different to how we used to work back then. But it was lovely to hear Les explain it all, and I really felt like I was back at PWL listening to him. That building was completely magical, and I have nothing but happy memories of my time working there. You heard David Howells mention in the first episode how they tried to encourage a family environment at PWL, and it really did feel like a family. When I started there, I was 18. I just left home. I was fresh off the boat from Ireland, didn't know anyone in London, didn't know anything. All I knew was that I had to be in that building. And as soon as I started there, I was made to feel like I belonged. Sherry, the studio manager, was like mum to all us tape ops, and she really looked out for us all. Like David said, there was really no separation between departments. So upstairs you had offices next to the kitchen, which were next to the TV room, which was next to the studio, and everyone was walking freely from one space to another. The place was buzzing, always a hive of activity. Downstairs you had reception, which was right next to the bunker studio. So chances are you'd hear bursts of whatever was being worked on in there. So when I worked for Ian in the very basement of the building, on the journey from his studio up to the kitchen to make him a coffee, I could potentially hear snatches of 3 different things being worked on. So Matt could be working on Bananarama in the Dungeon studio, which was right next to the Fairlight room. I'd go up the stairs and past the bunker where Phil could be mixing a Kylie record. And then up again to the kitchen while I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, I might hear Mike working on the next Lonnie Gordon record. It was just insane, really. Insanely exciting. Thanks to Les and Lynne for joining us. We'll be hearing more from them later in the series. Also, thanks to David Howells, to Demon Music Group for allowing me to include all the music you've heard today. If you haven't already got your copy of Nukleopatra, head over to demonmusicgroup.co.uk and get your copy now. In the next episode, we're back in the studio with Pete and Steve recording the next batch of tracks for the album. We'll be joined by the one and only Tracy Ackerman, who worked with the band for many years. We'll hear about her time in the studio with the boys, but also what life on tour with Dead or Alive is like. And let's just say, it wasn't dull. Big thanks for all your lovely messages and comments about the podcast. Glad to hear you're enjoying it. Keep up all the reposting and sharing. It really helps spread the word. And if you want to leave a nice review, that also helps others find us. You can find me at Barry Stone Music over on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok. You can also sign up to the mailing list over at barrystonemusic.co.uk and get access to Nukleopatra's Tomb, where you'll find bonus content from the podcast, all the stuff we couldn't fit in the main episodes. Join me next time for more Nukleopatra adventures. Until then, bye for now.